This is the Writers Are People Too podcast, where I just can't get writers to shut up. Tonight, we have with us co-owners of Choir Publishing and introducing for the first time on this podcast, I guess they've been on some other podcasts, Mr. and Mrs. No, I'm just kidding. Keith Giles and Matthew Distefano, first-time co-authors. So, glad to see that you guys have written a book together as you've been business partners for a little while. So, before we get into the book, brief intros from both of you, please.
Age before beauty, Keith.
Thank you. Well, my name is Keith Giles. I'm an author. I've written solo, I guess, like 12 books or something, 12 or 13 books. And I've been on this show a couple of times talking about a couple of them. I also, as you mentioned, co-owner of Choir Publishing with Matthew. And Matthew and I also do a podcast together called Heretic Happy Hour. We've been doing that for about 7, 8 years, something like that.
Yeah, I do very similar things. I own the business with Keith. I write books. My books tend to stray from the path. I get into like Tolkien's Legendarium and I do this kind of thing. And I also farm. And yeah.
Nice. Well, I'd love to hear more about that when we have more time, but we got to jam-pack this hour, I think. So, before we get into the content of the book, actually, I have some questions around co-authoring and that process and what that's been like. So, if you look, if you read the book and you skip past the table of contents and the foreword and the preface and the acknowledgments, and you actually get to the book, on page 7, I'm actually going to read this quote here. It says, how do we go about doing, let me just start over with that quote. I just don't even know what I'm saying. So, how we go about doing so will follow a typical back and forth Matt and Keith pattern. At times, our words will be biting, salty, and sarcastic, the parts typically written by Matthew. In other instances, they will be imbued with love, empathy, and compassion, the parts generally written by Keith. So what's it like trying to co-author a book with someone who has different communication styles than you? Would you say this was more difficult or more complimentary?
I will say this one was surprisingly
complimentary easy. As we talk over each other.
Yeah. Sorry.
It was shockingly easy. I expected us to fight a little more.
Yeah, the only real thing that I pushed back against, I don't know if Matt pushed back, remind me if you pushed back on something I wrote, but I do think I pushed back on something that Matt had written. And it was only because, this is a book about the book of Romans and the Apostle Paul and scholarship and all this kind of stuff. And he worked in something about Kendrick Lamar. And I just kind of thought, I think that might be out of place for our audience.
Couldn't help myself.
What was the reference to Michael from The Office from Matthew then?
Yeah, of course.
Of course, that was for me. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So as this is a book that's written out of conviction, it's not just like, hey, let's throw together some nice little fiction. Mm-hmm. Did you come across parts where your beliefs or interpretations differed, and how'd you handle that?
There were a few little quibbles I think that we had that were pretty minimal in terms of one of the main premise of the book is that Paul is in Romans is engaging in a back and forth diatribe with an imagined, very real false teacher sort of figure, but imagined in his mind and written by him, and parsing out exactly where he goes back and forth can be a little bit difficult. So I think there were a few things where I think I edited a few things that Keith had put, and then I conceded one. I know that Keith had, but very minimal.
I conceded some too, because I decided not to push it too much.
Well, yeah, and there were some places where it's like, this isn't the hill to die on. I feel like, and it's kind of the way we run business too. It's like there's hills I'll certainly die on, but they're pretty few and far between.
Yeah.
I feel like.
Yeah. I think what happened was too, like he's saying, so there's part of it, our argument in the book is that Paul is using this argumentation device called Prosopopeia. And then, so it's a back and forth dialogue, which isn't marked out in the Bible itself. So, you kind of have to we try to mark out those sections and here it is in bold if it's one voice, and it's italics if it's a different voice.
And scholars don't always agree. So
right. And that was part of the deal, right? So as I was going through it, very honestly, I didn't pay attention to what any other scholars had said for the voices. I just I did what made sense to me. on the back and forth voices. And then Matt pointed out that, well, actually other scholars like Douglas Campbell, they have this part being the other voice instead of the one that you had it. And a couple of them I was like, well, I don't know if I agree with that. But then at the same time, I'm kind of like Matt said, it's not a hill to die on, whatever.
Yeah. I must tip my hat to you then, for you did very well. I mean, your natural reading of it, which I think maybe proves our point.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't prove our point, but it's kind of lends evidence to, like, if you read this without some of our presuppositions and you read it naturally as if it's a dialogue, which it seems obvious that it is, like, you pretty much land in the right spot.
Yeah. I only missed a couple of spots maybe, but
yeah.
I'll have to take it up with Douglas Campbell, I guess, one of these days.
I'll let y'all decide that, because he's the scholar. I'm not.
Well, whatever. I'm joking.
So you mentioned Prosopopeia, which I had written down a question for that, which I was going to touch on later, but since you dragged it up front, we'll talk about it now. So for the audience, you kind of briefly mentioned that there's this internal dialogue between him and this false teacher. I've never heard that before. Where did you guys hear about this from other scholars? I'm assuming. When did that come about?
I first heard about it from Doug Campbell, professor at Duke. He wrote a 1,200-page book on Romans 1 through 4, and I read it because apparently I'm a glutton for punishment. And it's it's like he writes between English and Greek seamlessly, right? Like, so he writes bilingually in this book pretty much. And so you have to, it's not like something you sit down and enjoy the read.
Yeah.
So that's where I first heard it. And then I looked into, like, because in the church we lag behind, I guess, historically 100 years behind scholarship. So I had never heard of it either. I had never heard that there was just one way of reading Romans. It's like open the Bible and read it. Mm-hmm. And so this scholarship is too often confined to, like, the halls of academia. I know Campbell's also written a popular version, which is like 200 pages. I haven't read that, but I figured since I read the 1,200-page book, that was good enough. And so we try to make it a little more palatable for people who aren't going to read those things, but they still, they're impacted by Romans. I mean, there's all the anti-gay stuff, allegedly. There's the wrath of God stuff, allegedly. There's predestination to hell, allegedly. There's God hates Esau, allegedly. And there's all these things in Romans that people have used as a bludgeon within the church.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'll just say real quick. I came across this from a guy named Michael Harden, actually. Who's not very well known. He's not. I don't think he's not considered as much like a big name scholar as someone like David Bentley Hart or N.T. Wright or Douglas Campbell. So he's more of a popular teacher. But he was the first one I ever heard. He had like a series on YouTube, and he was going through the dialogue and pointing it out, and it just blew my mind. But then once I heard about it from him, again, I only heard it from one guy. It was kind of like, okay, but is that? I mean, I love it, but is that real? So then I had to go and like figure it out. Like, oh, okay, yes, okay. Other scholars also agree that there is this thing called Prosopopeia and how it works and dialogue and all that stuff. And so then once I basically verified it from other sources, I was pretty convinced that that's probably what's going on. And it makes sense. Honestly, when you see it and then you read it, it makes passages that previously in Romans didn't really make a lot of sense, because it almost felt like Paul was schizophrenic. He couldn't make up his mind. Like, he said this over here, but then he turns around and says the opposite over there. Like, what's he doing? But so it makes it make sense, like what's happening, what's really going on in Romans.
So Matthew mentioned that scholarship is perhaps 100 years ahead of modern Christianity. Do you think that there's a movement towards this? Is this still unknown? Do you think there's pushback against it because people are stuck in their ways and it's a narrative for control? Like, what's your opinion on that?
It's probably a whole bunch of different reasons. Like, I know like N.T. Wright wouldn't necessarily affirm Campbell's thesis, but he wrote the foreword for his book. Like, so within scholarship, the conversations often look a lot different than the ones we have like online or at church functions. So I think when it comes to, I mean, yeah, part of it has to be people are stuck in their ways. Part of it has to do with fear. There's a lot of fear-based doctrines within Christianity, and certainly a lot of fear-based theologies, or maybe not even fear-based, but like fear-infused theologies. And this kind of breaks it open and doesn't, like, within Paul's gospel, in this way of reading Romans, like, all glory to God, right? Like, God loves everyone. God is merciful to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
God's essential, like, Jesus's mission is essentially like a rescue mission of all of humanity. And that certainly would challenge the status quo within most churches.
Yeah, I think of it this way: if a church has been teaching something for 100 years,
2,000 years,
how open? Well, in America, let's say they've been teaching some of these things for about 100 years or so.
500 if they go back to Calvin them.
Calvin or Luther or something. But you know what I mean? Like, if you've been teaching something for hundreds of years, how open do you think you're going to be to, like, oops, we got it wrong, everybody? They're not, especially Christian churches are not open to that.
Yeah.
Well, and so much of Christian theology is actually based on Romans. Like, I think most of their, like, that's why Calvinists always turn to Romans, like 9. Yep. They always turn to certain things because that's like a lot of their theologies hinge on a very, very strict way of interpreting very narrow way of interpreting certain passages within Paul. Really, not a lot. Of Jesus,
I had originally written down to bring predestination into the conversation, but then I was like, we gotta keep going on time here. But since you're bringing it up, what's the passage you're referring to specifically, and how do people misinterpret that?
Well, I think the passage, right, is from Romans 9, where some have been created as vessels of wrath.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the passage that Calvinists will turn to and basically say that God made some people as objects of his wrath that he will punish forever. And there will be vessels of mercy, and those are the elect. Those are the ones God has elected before they're born for heaven, essentially. And what we point out in the book is Romans 9 doesn't end there. It's like it ends in, he's building an argument to the end of Romans 11, which is like, okay, so what if there are vessels of wrath? God has mercy. What if there are vessels of mercy? God has mercy. God has mercy on everyone.
Right, that's the point.
That's the point, and it's kind of like the punchline of a joke. Like, you don't stop before the punchline gets there and say that the comedian sucks. You have to listen to the punchline.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, like I mentioned earlier, we got a little bit ahead of ourselves, but going back to, let's introduce your book, because I don't think we've even done that. So, Reading Romans Right is the name of the book.
Yes.
Correcting Common Misreadings and Restoring Paul's Original Intent. So, what was your original reason for writing this book? And I know you guys refer to yourselves tongue-in-cheek as heretics. Or maybe not tongue-in-cheek, I don't know. But, what ultimately convinced you that the modern church is so wrong about so many parts of Romans?
Keith, you want to?
I'll just say, I think Matt and I share, and you can add the parts that are different for you, Matt. But when we both first started talking about the idea of writing this book, we were both just expressing our own frustrations with, like, so much, as Matt already said, so much of, like, ultra conservative, reformed Christian evangelicals, like people like the Gospel Coalition, and a lot of these reformed Christians, Calvinists, base so much of their theology on Romans. Really, without Romans, that it falls apart. But it's based on a misreading of Romans, right? In other words, like, if you read Romans right, if you read Romans the way Paul intended it, if you understood what he was saying, why he was saying it, who he was saying it to, the way he was saying it, and how that plays into your misunderstanding of it, like, then it falls apart, right? So many of their doctrines fall apart. And so many of those doctrines, it's not just about we're right and you're wrong, like we want to prove to them that they're wrong. It's that they're using Romans to hurt a lot of people, right? They're using Romans to condemn people that are gay or trans or queer. They're using Romans for the patriarchy, to silence women. They're using Romans to say that you should pledge blind allegiance to the state, and things like this, right? Saying that, we're in and everyone else is out. If you don't agree with our theology, you're going to burn in hell forever. And Paul absolutely does not teach any of those things in the book of Romans. So I think my motivation for writing it was I really want to, and I've wanted to for a long time, want to write a book that corrects this. And what I'm really hoping is going to happen, this is one of the things we're really hoping, we'll get some response from some of these Bible teachers and theologians and pastors who think that Romans does say those things. Like, I want them to read the book. I want them to point by point refute what we're saying. Show me where we're wrong, please. I want to have that conversation. I want to have that debate. But ultimately, I want the Christians in the pews to read this book and realize that they've been taught Romans wrong, that Romans doesn't support almost any of those doctrines.
Would you say that the audience for this book then, is it for pastors and theologians and teachers, or is it for the average American to read it and then say, why are the teachers teaching me this incorrectly?
I don't know, Matt, what you think?
I think probably both. Like, I think the latter is more, I think most of our focus is on the latter, but I definitely want to engage the people who, like, I remember, and Keith can tell the story, like, he's debated scholars, so-called doctors, who haven't heard of this view of Romans, yet they teach clear biblical truths from the Bible, from the New Testament, but they don't, it's not that you have to agree with us. And we use reading Romans right tongue in cheek. Like, we're not saying this is like the only way to read the Bible. And we're certainly not saying this is the most exhaustive book on the subject. But I think the main point we're trying to make is, like, you can't, like, I don't know how you can have a conversation where this is like what you teach about and not know the most arguments against your own point. Like, if you don't even know what we're talking about in this book, and you yourself are a teacher of this Bible, this thing we call the Bible, like, that should be a problem to you, because you don't know the most advanced scholarship that goes against your view. And me personally, like, I know when I first, let's say, heard of universal reconciliation in Christianity, I didn't just look for things that made me feel good about it and like, oh, this, I'm looking for all the things that I want to find that makes my point seem more valid. I was like, well, I better look at all the arguments against it, because it needs to hold up for me to take it seriously. Like, it can't fall under the weight of scrutiny. Otherwise, it's just something I don't need to deal with anymore. Like, once it gets scrutinized and it doesn't stack up, but that, okay, you could brush it aside. So please come brush aside our argument in this book.
Please.
Which is really twofold. Like, it's like, okay, so either if Paul is reading or writing the book like we're reading him, then he does make sense. But if he's not and you refute us, then show me how he's just not a, kind of like Keith said, schizophrenic thinker who contradicts himself all the time. And if he's that, then why do we take him that seriously? Because he does seem to be that if we read him plainly.
Yeah. So we've mentioned a few topics so far, but which of Paul's teaching do you think the modern church tends to incorrectly interpret, rather, if you want to just outline a few of them?
Well, the main one in the book, I think salvation theory is kind of the big one we go after in this. Like, the story of that you're a wretched worm, you realize there's a God of justice, you realize you're a sinner, you need to cry out for mercy, you need to, like, basically guilt and shame will help propel you from phase 1 to phase 2, and once you're in phase 2, you're saved, and that's the story. That's kind of the story. Like, that one we really go after. And then there's a lot of, because it's Romans, there's a lot of other teachings, like, is Paul homophobic? Does God have wrath in God's self? Does Paul seem to want to advocate for blind allegiance to the state, no matter who the state is? So we get into all that, but I think the big one is sort of what is the salvation story we as Protestants are telling? Because this is a Protestant issue. That's not the story that Orthodox and Catholics have. That's a primarily Protestant narrative.
Yeah, and then the other part of it, embedded in what Matt just described, I think, is the question of there's a specific verse in Romans that most English translations of the Bible will translate as faith in Christ, as part of that salvation theory, right? So your salvation is based on your having faith in Christ, whether your personal agreement and belief in certain doctrines, that's what saves you. But as we talk about in the book, there are a lot of scholars that believe that that's a mistranslation. And Matt can talk to this a lot better than I can, about that actually the phrase in the Greek should actually be translated as the faithfulness of Christ. In other words, it's Christ's faithfulness that saves everyone. It's not an individual faith in Jesus that saves us. And that's a pretty big misunderstanding of what Paul's saying in Romans.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, there's probably a lot of reasons why that happens, but at least in America, American Protestants certainly have a very egocentric view. We're very pull yourself up by your bootstraps, American individualism. Our theology tends to be that it's individual salvation. It's my personal relationship with Jesus. And Paul, it seemed in this reading, at least, like Paul had a very corporate understanding. Like it wasn't to poo-poo an individual relationship, but when it came to Christ's mission, it was very universal. Like it's a rescue mission for all of humanity, and God achieves God's purpose. Who are you to question the mind of God? God will have mercy on anyone God wants to have mercy on, i.e. everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So you could be a vessel of mercy or a vessel of wrath. You have nothing to boast in but Christ. You know, that's what you boast in. That's what your trust is in. That's a very different way of reading Paul than, you know, the salvation theory I just talked about that Protestants have, which is very individualized. It's about my sinful nature, my relationship with Christ, my turn. All those things can be important, but it didn't seem like that was like the primary focus of this letter.
So I've heard from many people who are not American that Americans have a very individualized look at everything. And it seems like we've taken that and applied it to Christianity as well, is kind of what you're saying. Have you heard any of these ideas differently in other cultures or other countries, or have you studied that at all?
Well, I think Judaism has always been a very corporate type of religion. Like they're not out there proselytizing, trying to convert you.
Yeah.
It's like Judaism was waiting like for a Messiah. It was going to like liberate them, not just like me.
Yeah.
I think Mahayana Buddhism is very other oriented. Like you put off your own path of enlightenment to help those around you seek enlightenment. So it's different than Theravada Buddhism. But I would tend to guess that Americans do individualism the most, but I don't.
Well,
I mean, that's
I think
my context.
maybe I misworded the question a little bit. This wasn't so much in regard to other religions, but how countries outside of the United States see the book of Romans as far as salvation being individualistic.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church doesn't take the same kind of view of hell or of salvation. And so they don't have a Western sort of, American influence on their theology. Yeah. And so that's one of the most obvious ones. Like they weren't corrupted by all the same kind of church leaders that the American church ended up following.
Yeah, as far as I understand, the Eastern Orthodox view of hell, like everyone's in God's presence. Some just view it as or experience it as like white hot wrath, but it's nothing but the love of God.
Yeah.
So I think the way in Eastern Orthodox, because like to me that makes more sense, at least metaphysically. Like you can't escape God's presence. Like in the Western notion of hell, it's almost like a polytheism of sorts, because you're separated from God entirely, but then how does that even work?
But yeah, a God who apparently is everywhere at all times, who Paul says fills everything in every way, and yet somehow you're going to be separated from, like it seems like it's impossible to be, and there's no such thing as a place where God is not. And
at least the Eastern Orthodox have, well, you're not literally separated. You're separated from the relationality because you experience God's love as God's wrath.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we briefly touched on this before, And I think how do I word this? You in the book you touched on how the LGBTQ plus community has been disparaged by people reading Romans incorrectly. What would you say to people in that community who have been spurned by Christianity?
I guess it depends on who we're talking to. I'm not myself a Christian any longer, and I am a part of the LGBTQ community. So I think those conversations would look different depending on where someone is individually at.
Yeah, if the person is gay, and we've interviewed a lot of people, we published a lot of people who are gay and Christian.
Well, Brandon wrote the foreword.
Yeah, Brandon Robertson, who wrote the foreword to this book, Reading Romans, is also a gay pastor. And yeah, we published and interviewed people on our podcast who've gone through conversion therapy and came out the other end still holding on to their faith. So I think what I would say to anybody, if you're a Christian or you have faith in God and you feel like the church is condemning you and the church is condemning you because they believe the Bible is condemning you, and if they believe that, they probably think it's because of most of the things that Paul has said, either in Romans or 1 Corinthians or places like this. I would encourage anyone in that position that there are lots of other books that deal with this much more specifically, this question much more specifically. We don't go into it in great depth in this book, although we do touch on it. But there are so many resources for people to realize that those clobber passages, those scriptures in 1 Corinthians, the scripture in Romans, that those are mistranslations. That by the way, the word homosexual is in the English translation of the New Testament in 1 Corinthians, but that word doesn't mean homosexual. It does. In fact, it wasn't in the Bible until like 1946 or 48, something like that. And it was not changed.
47, maybe.
There's a documentary. I thought it was 1946.
Yeah, 46. Maybe it's 46.
Yeah. So there's a whole documentary about this change that was made to the English translation of the Bible. No English translation of the Bible before that time translated any of those passages with the word homosexual. In fact, most of them translated that word as somebody who was a pedophile, essentially. So it wasn't originally, those passages weren't condemning homosexuals or queer people or gay people or anything like that. So I would just say, if you're in a church that's telling you that, if you're sitting under a pastor that's teaching you that, find another one and do some more research, because what they're telling you is similar to what we're pointing out in this book, where, again, there's hundreds of years of tradition that don't really line up with, when you go and look at the text itself, that's not exactly what's actually being taught.
Yeah, and it's important also, like, I think there's two things to keep in mind. Like, the Bible, getting to what the Bible says might be important for you, and that's great. I think it's important to look at historical documents and get to what was the meaning of the text. Like, what did the author mean to convey here? So we never want to make the Bible clean and make it say something that it doesn't say, or make it cleaner than, like, it does say a lot of bad stuff that I would not think is appropriate for a modern civilized society.
Yeah. Slavery, for example. Yeah.
For example.
Yeah.
But also, we have to be really careful that even if it does say that and we revere the Bible, that we always lean on the side of mercy for people. Like, it does seem that Christians go out of their way with some scant evidence that is, like, homophobic, right? Like, we have clobber passages, there's like 7 of them. Do we know how many passages are just in the Old Testament about welcoming the foreigner?
Mm-hmm.
You don't hear Christians talking about that with regards to immigration policy. In fact, when they do talk about it, they're like, kick people out.
Mm-hmm. Even though the scriptures are full of commands to care for the immigrant.
Hundreds of them, to treat the immigrant like your neighbor as yourself. Who is your neighbor? It's everyone around you.
Yeah.
Like, there is to be no distinguish, like, and Christians will go out of their way to all of a sudden become really nuanced with those passages,
Mm-hmm.
but very, very zoned in on a quote unquote literal reading of a quote unquote clobber passage. And so then it comes to like, what is the heart of the people who quote these things?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think we always, if you're a person of faith, if you believe in God, I think you always need to lean on the side that if it comes down to my interpretation of the Bible, or if it comes down to loving my neighbor as myself, I'm always going to choose the latter.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you guys touched on that where I don't remember the exact quote, but it was in, gosh, I could pull up the reference, but it was somewhere in Romans where he says, love your neighbor.
Mm.
That's not the exact quote. You guys know it better than I do because you wrote the book.
Yeah.
Well, if this is a Bible trivia question, I don't remember the exact passage.
Yeah.
It was towards the end of the book. I would have to
maybe
to look up the reference
12.
again, but it was very reminiscent of what Jesus said, where he said, all the laws and the prophets hang on this, that you should love the Lord your God and love your neighbors yourself. It was similar to that. I don't remember.
There's a lot of good stuff in Romans 12. There's probably a lot
yeah,
of
it's
stuff
probably Romans 12, something about do not be overcome by evil, overcome evil with good. Feed your enemies if they're hungry, if they're thirsty, give them something to drink. Yeah, those kinds of, I'm sure it's somewhere in that passage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think modern Christianity is missing empathy. I think it's all about legalism and doing the quote unquote right thing so you go to heaven.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are missing the loving your neighbor part and people who are different than you.
Yeah.
And I think that we could use that change.
Yeah, I agree. And what's funny is that the irony is that according to Matthew 25, what Jesus says in Matthew 25, if your goal is like, I've got to do the right thing to get to heaven, like you said, what does Jesus say in Matthew 25 is, quote unquote, the right thing you need to do to get to heaven? It's to have empathy, right? Well, what have you done for the least of these? You did it to me. Well, what would that be? Feeding someone who's hungry, giving water to someone who's thirsty, visiting someone who's in prison, caring for somebody who's, on the outside. That's what Jesus makes the criteria for, quote unquote, going to heaven, right? Mm-hmm. Do you have empathy or not? And the irony is, he's right about this. A lot of the people that called him Lord, Lord, were like, oh, we think we're going to get in. We think we're the sheep. We're on the sheep side. He says, well, no, you didn't do those things. They're like, what are you talking about? It's like, well, because when you didn't, when you ignored those people, you were ignoring me. So, I think it's ironic in some ways.
They gone so far as to call empathy sin now.
Yeah, of course.
It's a sin of empathy.
Yes, that's but it's bananas. It's like you can't love your neighbors yourself without empathy, right? How are you going to do anything?
Definitional.
Yeah, you need empathy to do almost everything Jesus said.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think you had marked that you wanted to read an excerpt. Did one of you guys or both you guys, you want to do it in unison, like a little choir or something, or what?
Oh, did we say that? I don't remember that.
No, you marked on there. That. If you don't want to, that's fine. We can just end it here.
Okay. I don't remember wanting to read anything. No.
It's funny because I feel like every time you've come on the podcast, you've marked yes, and I always ask you, and you're like, I don't remember doing that.
Is there something on the thing that says, do I want to read a passage? I don't.
Yeah,
I guess
it says you want to read an excerpt.
I don't know. Well, I guess I could find something. I don't know.
You could read the synopsis.
Where would that be? On the back?
On the back of the book.
Well, Romans Reexamined is about how for the longest time, Paul's epistle to the Romans has been used to justify misogyny, homophobia, eternal conscious torment, and blind allegiance to the state. However, the truth is that the Apostle Paul never intended his letter to the church in Rome to teach any of those things. And that's why Matthew and myself have collaborated to correct these misunderstandings and illuminate the true meaning of Paul's theological masterpiece for today's Christian reader. There you go.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. Any final comments?
I don't know. I do hope, though, that we can get some people to read the book. And again, I would love if a pastor reads it and has a bone to pick with something that we're saying. If somebody wants to let's jump on a Zoom, let's do a conversation, let's do a debate. Would love to hear reasoned, thoughtful responses to the arguments that we're making in this book and the things we're pointing out in the book. That's why we wrote it. Really, we want people to think and to question and to wrestle with this stuff. Hopefully, and we've had a lot of people who've read the book already, who've told us that the book has helped them. A lot of people that have said, I'm done with Paul, I'm done with the Bible, I'm done with Romans, who've been like, hey, wow, I feel like I can I can read Paul again, or I can go back and read Romans again, and not have some kind of trigger reaction. So, yeah, that's our hope.
Yeah, we might even host it on the Heretic Happy Hour.
There you go. Come on in.
But yeah, I would hope that people, if they're interested in this kind of stuff, would subscribe to our podcast, Heretic Happy Hour. Wherever you're listening to this one, I'm sure you can find us, and that's where Keith and I will be.
Yep.
Talking about this stuff and whatever's next, because we're going to try to do a whole series and invite friends of ours to comment on books that I don't want to comment on, like I don't know, Joshua or Judges. Maybe I'll do Song of Solomon.
Yeah, but no, we do want this to be a series. So it's if at the top of the book it says, the Choir Bible series. This is hopefully book 1 in a series. Like I want to do Hebrews. I think that's also a very misunderstood book. Matt and I've talked about doing Revelation, which is probably the most misunderstood book, but I don't know. It's such a mess. That book is not an easy one.
Yeah, we have to compete with Left Behind. So
yeah, I know.
We'll see.
and that seems to be coming true right now. So it's hard to argue.
Ironically, like God,
I never thought
we might have to rethink the.
I might have to rethink my view
again.
of Revelation. Yeah.
Well,
I even got it down to the mark on the forehead.
I know the whole thing. Yeah.
Right,
getting hit by the assassin, and then he survives the head wound. Come on.
I don't know. That's not a mortal wound, if you ask me. I'm still waiting for the real hit to come.
Okay.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah.
We had Keith Giles and Matthew Distefano from Choir Publishing. Look forward to hearing from you guys in the future.
Thanks, Matt.